So good evening, and thank you very, very much for coming to this Art Now speaker series presentation. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Ed Pien and welcome him back to Western, and to say a few words about it. I've known and admired Ed and his work for about 20 years, ever since I moved here from BC, although it's not about me, I know. At that point, we were both members of the Redhead Gallery in Toronto, or I think Ed was going out and I was coming in. Ed was then working fairly small scale with brush and ink, building up drawings in series using a layering process that was a bit like a sort of homemade animation technique. It's interesting for me to observe that over the period since then, Ed's work, which is still drawing-based, has become increasingly cinematic, albeit with a great sense of physicality. And his work sometimes now includes actual animation and video within remarkable spaces constructed through drawing. So Ed is based in Toronto, was born in Taipei, Taiwan, and immigrated to Canada with his family at age 11 and grew up in London, Ontario. He holds a BFA degree from Western and an MFA from York University. He's exhibited nationally and internationally, including at the Drawing Center in New York, La Biennale de Montreal, at W139 in Amsterdam, the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver, Middlesbrough Art Gallery, the UK, the Goethe Institute in Berlin, Blue Coat Liverpool, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, and the National Gallery of Canada. Among his most recent exhibitions was his inclusion in the Sydney Biennale last year, which was co-curated by Gerald McMaster, who will speak here, actually in this room, in Art Now, later in the term on March 13th. Ed has taught at Emily Carr University, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and OCADU, and he currently teaches part-time at the University of Toronto. It was the good fortune of some of our first-year students at Western a number of years ago when Ed came and taught a short-term installation drawing workshop that resulted in an exhibition in the Art Lab, and the results were fantastic. So Ed is represented by Birch Contemporary in Toronto, Pierre-François Ouellette in Montreal, and also another gallery in The Hague, whose name I won't try and pronounce. So could you help me welcome Ed Pien?
Thank you, Patrick, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give a speech here, or present my work, and also do the studio visits. My voice is a bit off because I gave a all-day workshop to high school students on Friday, and then I think I just continue non-stop talking. I don't have a cold or anything, but it's just a bit irritating, so maybe once in a while I have to cough. I'm not sure, and I'll try to cover the microphone. But I would like to thank you all for coming, attending this presentation. And I was just earlier on at the Jury Award, and I really appreciate the excitement and the energy. That's quite rare because where I teach, the department is quite small, so we don't really see a gathering of students. And as Patrick had mentioned before, that I was from Western years and years ago, and it had an influence, a huge impact on the way I practice and the way I kind of engage in the world. And in fact, at that time, Ken Moody was one of my profs who taught me painting, and he doesn't age, he's still the way he is. And I would like to thank Damiana Bartus for coming. She's a dear friend of mine from 35, I don't know how many years ago, Damiana, but I've known each other 30-some years ago. And she actually taught music here at Western. And I'm a bit worried because I have really good colleagues here who does amazing work. And so I'm going to show you some work, and hopefully you have some questions to ask me. There are a lot of things that I'm experimenting and exploring and thinking about. And one of them is the sense of trace. To me, the trace is really important because for me as an artist, when I'm drawing, I'm always leaving a mark. But that mark doesn't exist by itself. It came from a previous mark. And this actually took place in 1983 when I started to make a series of daily self-portraits, where I actually made monoprints of the drawing that I'm working on while it's still wet. I made a kind of a print so that it had this kind of spectral evidence of previous existence. And then I will work on that of that drawing for the next day. I did a series of portraits every day for 3 years. So there's always this monoprinting that allowed the next drawing to be drawn on. So when I'm making art, I'm always thinking about how did I come to this place and where is it taking me? When I was in Dawson City about 2 years ago, I wanted to draw outside, but I couldn't because it was minus 45 degrees. And I started to just take photographs. But I found that every time I started to take a picture, my presence was always there. The sense of my trace is always there. And it was kind of obscuring the view because of my breath. So I decided to consciously breathe into the landscape as I made the photo to capture my presence. So I thought this constitutes a kind of drawing, which in a way is not what's considered normally a drawing, but I feel drawing for me is healthy when you can actually push it as far as it can go. When I was making these works, I was also thinking about the sense of ectoplasm. In the turn of the century, people were faking in their photographs this kind of spectral presence, and I thought this is really wonderful as a play, kind of thinking about what constitutes a photograph, what constitutes the constructiveness of a photograph. So the only thing I did to these photographs were I heightened or enhanced the contrast in Photoshop, but everything else is there. So in my work, you'll get to know it fairly shortly. I'm really interested in the sense of the spectral, a sense of haunting. And I would say the way I'm interested in the sense of the ghostly isn't so much about the spookiness of a ghost or this kind of gothicness of a ghost. I'm not interested in the bloodiness or the kind of the terrors. I'm really interested in what constitutes a ghost, what kind of haunts me or haunt us collectively. And I feel there are different kinds of ghosts in the world, and in fact we can be our own ghosts that haunt us in the future if we were to do something at this moment that would constitute a haunting. So I'm really interested in how the past fuels the present and has an influence or impact on the future. So that again is a sense of trace for me. And in grade 8, in London, Ontario, at Empress. I don't know if you know Empress. It's now the Pierre Trudeau Public School. In grade 8, my teacher told us about Hiroshima. And this was a time when there was no internet, and I was really intrigued by that event. He literally just told us a story. He made it quite real, saying that there are about 250,000 people in London, Ontario. Can you imagine if all the people just died in an instant? So I ran to the library afterwards, and I started to look in the books about this incident. And I would say that probably shaped the way I make work, because again, I'm really interested in the sense of trace, sense of kind of disappearance, the sense of haunting, the sense of trauma. And many issues arose from looking at photographs such as this, because in a way, it's, as Susan Sontag kind of suggests, why are we looking at these photographs? She has many kind of, I would say, views about photographs and what they do, including thinking about the way that, like she questions whether or not there is a sense of collective guilt. She says there isn't. It's really about a collective sense of teaching. But I also started recently to read a book on haunting and trauma, and the writer, which I'll come to later on, Pien is his name, but he talks about, well, maybe the question isn't so much about why look at the photographs, but it's how to look at the photographs. So I will kind of talk about that in a little bit of time. So for me, this was traumatic in the sense that at this point, I was like 13 or 14, I really felt this world is good if you have a nice family, they love you, and that's how it would kind of play out. I didn't realize that there was this darker side. And I'm jumping quite a bit because I have 30 years worth of art and I can't show you everything, but literally what I was interested in, what influenced me most of all in a way is also the way when I was in Taiwan doing a residency in 1996, I came upon this book called The Mountains and Seas Classics. And in it, there are depictions of these weird animals, creatures. They're kind of hybridized. I really love that kind of image, only insofar as, for me, I feel there's a freedom, a liberated moment when your body defies the notion of what constitutes normal. And in fact, around 2000, the year 200, in fact, there's a scholar, his name is Guopu, he's a proponent of this book, and he says, a thing in itself is not strange, it is I who makes it strange. Now, I love that because, in a way, when I'm making my art, I'm always kind of questioning my own assumptions and challenging my preconceptions of different things. So, in a way, in terms of making art, I feel it's okay to ask those questions. It's okay to push my own boundaries and limits. So, what I'm going to show you is a series of drawings, I guess, in a more traditional way, using ink and on paper. But I'll just show you a little bit of images that inspire me, including this one, which is about transformation. I'm just fascinated with the fact that in a one pictorial space, that there could be this shift, this time kind of based element where one figure transforms into another. This is based on the very famous Monkey King classics, and this old woman is actually in the midst of transforming into a beautiful maiden to seduce this pig person, or creature. I love the show of kind of this appearance or disappearance. And when I'm drawing, as I mentioned earlier, and I didn't state that very well about my portraits, is when I'm making a drawing, while it's still wet, I would use another sheet of paper and I would do a monoprinting. So that monoprinting lifts up whatever is still wet, and that becomes the kind of the ghostly presence for me to work on for the next day. So to this day, when I'm drawing, I'm always, in a way, still trying to leave a trace, marks. So this is a part of a drawing session where I continually make these monoprinting while I'm making a drawing. So eventually there's enough information on this drawing that I can start to work on it. But what I find compelling for myself with this kind of drawing is that even though these are my marks and gestures, they are also denied my presence in that when the ink is still wet and it's sitting on the top of the paper, when I press the ink down, it flattens and it shifts and it makes its own mark based on its own conditions. So I like the fact that I'm kind of interacting or collaborating with the making of some marks. And there are certain marks that I can never make with brush or pencil because I feel these are beautiful marks that can only happen given a certain kinds of condition. So sometimes I would accumulate marks, and that's all there is. I don't do any more to it. Other times I intervene, and I would do a really fast drawing. So in this case, there's a 3-minute really fast drawing over top of all that mess. I would sometimes use white gouache to push some of the, I would call it noise, down, to also, at the same time, allow certain marks to come up to accentuate this kind of figuration. So in my drawings, I'm always kind of fighting or playing with the balance between representation and abstraction. This one's called the Blue-Haired Witch, and I don't know if you can tell from the pieces of paper that I showed you, they're all 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, they're very small, so this allows me the ability to very easily do these monoprints without having to flip large sheets of paper. And at a certain moment, when I have enough of these marks, not so finished as this one, I would start to kind of put them on the floor to build up, to see what I can work with. And some of them, I would gather them and make really fast 3-minute drawings on top. So I may take 100 of them and I will work for a certain amount of time, and I will push them. So within the same drawings, there's this kind of play with different temporality, different speeds. So in this drawing, for instance, it's about 16 feet across. It's done over the course of about 8 years, because when I'm drawing, I'm also thinking about other characters that I've done already that want to participate in this narrative. And the narratives are complicated in the sense that I feel in this world, there are multiple narratives taking place at any given moment. So among all the events that are taking place there may be this more overall, let's say, the grand narratives, but there are always these other smaller events that are unfolding. So I'll show you a little detail. So there's one. So for me, what's exciting about this is that in that same field, and you can see, well, you can't really see it very well, but these are all 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper that I start to paste and glue together with tape. And so they generate, the story continues, it expands, and at any moment I can actually slice the paper up and make it smaller or reconfigure it. And sometimes because the figures, the drawings are taking so long to make, I feel some of the figures don't want to be participating in that event or those events, and I start to take them out and ship them around. So I actually sometimes use collage in the work. So for me, there's a freedom in generating a drawing in the sense that it doesn't ever have to finish. I kind of stop working on them because they can continue, they can expand indefinitely, or they can reduce in scale depending on the circumstance. And for me, there's also freedom in the ability to cut them up, so I can roll them up into smaller tubes and take them to different places to show them. So that sense of economy of, let's say, shipping or packing and storage is really important to me, because as an artist, I'm always accumulating stuff, and I need to find better ways to not have it overwhelm my studio space. So these kind of drawings, they can be rolled up into smaller tubes, or they can be chopped up, or they can just be, they can go back into these 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. The most recent works that I'm doing right now are black paper, and these are some of the drawings I'm hoping to show at the Macintosh in November 2015. These are black drawings, and I don't know if you can see it very well. They are done with white ink on black paper, and these paper are really fairly expensive, and they come from a pad. And when I started to make them, it was because I was inspired by a bird dropping outside a darkened, on a darkened sidewalk just outside of Tate Modern. For me, it was like an ectoplasm. It was like a spectral entity that was just sitting there on the sidewalk. And I lamented the fact that I didn't have a camera to capture this form. So when I came back to Toronto, I decided that I would try to chase after this very elusive event. And so what I've started to do is just using white ink simply on black paper. What I didn't realize is that the front and the back of the sheet, the paper, are quite different in terms of blackness. And once I realized that, I started to play with the structure in the drawing so that the space is never taken for granted. So it's not, in fact, just an empty space where you put a drawing on. It becomes an architectural element. More recently, I've started to actually make these drawings in semi-darkness so that I actually don't know where the paper is. I'm actually having to feel the surface and then have the contact with the brush on the paper to tell me where the paper surface is, which I find really interesting because when I turn the lights on again and see these drawings, they seem to be quite different from what I've done. So in this drawing process, the sense of touch, this very haptic process becomes fairly important in the making of these works. What I'm interested in this kind of work is also how much can I not draw in to allow the image to appear as if it's kind of appearing or disappearing into this kind of architectural space. So these are some of the different scales I'm thinking of, and for the show at the Macintosh, I'm thinking of painting the walls black so that these drawings will then somehow seem completely connected to each other, even though they're on separate sheets of paper. And I'm hoping that the light will be fairly dark in the space so that the surface of the paper isn't illuminated, but the drawing will just pop out. So working with the white is also interesting because at a certain moment when I gather density in an area, it becomes this luminous site, it becomes this light, which is very different from the way I use black and red and different colors of ink. I call these spectral drawings. So I'm going to show you something from way back. It's still one of my favorite works of art. An installation that it's one of my first installations, and it's called Ghost. And it was made in 1997, and it was shown at the Oberon Gallery in Montreal. I had gone back to Taiwan in 1996 to research into ghosts. And so I think this is where I actually started to do serious research for my work. which I think is really important to propel my knowledge and what I know already further, and to add, I would say, depth to my work. So I went back to research into ghosts, but I was really interested in the shamans and the superstitions that exist in Taiwan. And so when I came back to Canada, I started to make drawings. And I made a series of drawings that are green. Green is the color that symbolizes ghosts in Taiwan and in many Asian countries. And I think part of the reason is because bones phosphorize, and when they come out from the graveyard, they give out this green glow, and people think ghost is green. That's my theory, I'm not sure. But I started to make a series of drawings that are just based on my imagination and also based on things that I've seen that I felt seemed like ghosts. So these weren't copies of other people's works, but they were definitely inspired by folklores and mostly Japanese movies and woodcuts. So there's one which is one of the most famous ghost stories in Japan, and her name is Oiwa. So here I'm actually interested in the ghost in the sense that it becomes this violence, but the violence is translated into a sense of revenge and sense of how do you deal with a ghost that's coming back to haunt you. So in my own work, I'm interested in ghosts in the sense that I feel if they do exist, and I don't know if they exist, but if you told me they exist, I say ghosts exist for you. But I'm interested in how to negotiate. You thinking about ghosts, because as ghosts come into our lives, for instance, you can't kill it, you can't throw it out somehow. You have to negotiate with them. And I find this really interesting as a strategy to kind of deal with fellow human beings. Instead of saying it's easy, just kind of use violence, how about using negotiations as a way to kind of reconciliate, let's say. I did a whole series of these green drawings. There were, as I've mentioned, over 200 of them, but I wasn't very happy with them because I felt I've illustrated this fictitious, this imaginary ghost. So I started to think about what is it that haunts me as a living person on this earth. And I realized they're in fact, like the first photographs that I saw when I was in grade 8, these kind of violent events. And I really felt that as a person, these are ghosts, and I'm haunted by this past. Even though I didn't participate in these violence, I really feel collectively maybe I was part of it. So here is where it gets interesting that several years ago, I presented this image at a talk at the University of Ottawa. One of the art historians asked me, so, like, who are these people? Do you have a name to them? And I said no, because when I kind of gathered the image, I just kind of see it as this illustration in a way, even though however gruesome. And she said, well, no, it's not right, because that person has died, and you have no right to just take that person without acknowledging that person, his name or the event, which I totally agree. And to this day, I still can't find this information. But what's really interesting is there's a Taiwanese artist, his name is Qian Jieren. He actually talks about how with a photograph like this person who has passed away has actually suffered 2 different deaths. The first, and I'll quote him, the first one is death of the body that has endured the torture. And the second, he says, and I find this completely relevant, that he has, in this instance, I think it's a guy, he says, this person, the eternal loss of agency experienced by the photographed. After the torturous image is fixed by the photographic process. And I find that really interesting that while he has already died, he also has lost a sense of control over how his own image is disseminated in perpetuity. So that's in my mind when I'm making work. So I started to draw out, based on reality now, these other ghosts. So you can see here, it's probably influenced by one of the concentration camp images. And I also devised a way to make these drawings in that I felt when I was putting ink onto paper, the marks were too fixed, they were too tangible. So what I started to do was I started to wet a sheet of paper, and then I would wet another sheet of paper. I would draw on top, and the ink would actually travel through and stay in the interstices of the 2 paper, and it would just start to bleed. So I have to quickly, once I finish making the drawing, I have to quickly take the drawing off, and use a hairdryer to fix that drawing so that it has still this remnant of a figure, kind of a body. So what I decided to do as well is I felt this wasn't enough. I was still illustrating another kind of ghost, but I thought if I were to combine the two different kinds of ghosts together, there will be something there for the viewers to kind of take over and decipher or construct. So in this case, because both pieces of paper are translucent, they're able to play off of each other. So I found this, for me at least, it was quite effective as a way to try to find that ghost. Maybe it's never found, but at least it's kind of in the midst of maybe appearing. So when I did the piece, the show for Obero, it's an installation. What I did was I pinned these drawings on the walls, and the top drawing is pinned just on the top 2 corners, and the lower drawing is pinned on all 4 corners. So when you walk into space, you will see a wall of these drawings of ghosts, and some have been enlarged because I felt that they could actually easily shapeshift or transform or flow around. Again, that's just my preconception of what a ghost is. But in terms of just playing with the space, it was really a thrill to be able to take small drawings and put them and build them up into a bigger element, and allowing the viewers' participation to allow them to physically engage with the work. So at a certain point when you walk into the space, what you would trigger a motion detector, and in that instant, the white lights would change to green. And at the same time, the ceiling fan starts to spin, and it pushes the top drawings off the wall, revealing the black drawings. And also what's happened is the green lights seem to cancel out the green lines or the green drawings. So in that instant, the imaginary ghost disappeared and gave way to the real ghost, in my conceptual thinking. I use these bare light bulbs because for me, the basement is the scariest place on the planet. And that's how our basement was like. So I had these haphazardly placed in the gallery space. So as you walked around, you may bump into one if you weren't paying attention. So the entire space is kind of set up this way. I had also fairly large drawings on one side. And a close friend of mine, who's a wonderful artist herself, Julie Voice, she saw the show. And when she saw this drawing, she thought it was like an opera. She said, this is an event, this is like a narrative. And it was only at that time I started to consider a narrative in my work. So at this moment, these real ghosts are walking underneath the imaginary ghosts to travel around the space. I've also set up the space in a way that really situated the viewer in this kind of zone where they have to decide to enter into gallery. And then once they enter into the gallery, they have to also part these green veil to enter into the actual space. So this kind of boundaries that were set up was really interesting as a kind of psychological play. The reason I had to build this wall is because the gallery was, it just flowed freely into the office area. And I didn't want that kind of reality paired with my space. And so I built a space with an opening that's exactly my size, so it's my width and my height. So one of the reviewers in the local paper said, oh, I get it, we now have to walk through your body to get inside your head. I quite like that. But it's more the fact that I really want to set up this other space for you to experience. And there are certain things that are completely unanticipated, and that's great as an artist because you can never fully control or anticipate everything. In this case, because I had made the entrance fairly small, at the back end of the gallery where the photograph is taken, it feels you've, in fact, traveled the space that's twice as far away from the space because of the play with the illusion, the perspectives. So for some people, it became quite daunting that they didn't want to be so far into the space, and yet they're transported there without them knowing. Another thing that was really interesting is that when the papers were floating around on the walls, if you're there by yourself, you would actually hear them scratch the wall. So for some people, that was really eerie as well. But that aside, what I wanted to create isn't a haunted house. I really wanted to create an experience to think about what constitutes a ghost. And it doesn't have to be real in the sense that it's this kind of bloodthirsty, menacing entity. And I actually, at this moment, I would like to share with you a story which I can clearly demonstrate a ghost. And it happened in Ottawa when I gave studio visits like today. There was one student, I followed her up to her space, and she was limping. She had a hard time getting up the stairs. And I realized she had 2 prosthetics for her legs. And when we got to her space, she showed me 3 large-scale canvases, they're paintings. Literally, your body can be just taken over by these spaces. So we were standing in the center. There was a painting of a coat that's with these arms spread out. There's a tree trunk, that's another painting. And there's another painting of a car with its front end dented. She said, my work is about trauma theory, and I lost my legs because I was hit by that car, pinned to this tree, and that's my coat. And she proceeded to go to the back to bring out her coat to show me this kind of material evidence that she wanted to prove to me that that's what happened to her. And I thought, wow, this is a ghost, because this woman has been haunted and she's kind of stuck in this place and she can't leave. And I said to her, like, I've never experienced anything like this, and forgive me for being ignorant. I said, has anything positive come about from this event? And she said, oh my God, like that day I was supposed to take my daughter with me. Had she been there, she would have been killed. I always hated my job. Working for the government, I always want to be an artist, and here I am taking art. So I don't know what I did, but I felt she had to confront that event, and she's stuck in that event until she can get past it. So to me, that was like a ghostly moment, even though she's not dead, and she's very present. That's my story. Anytime you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to ask me. I'm not being very articulate today because I just feel like I'm consciously aware of my throat, and it's wreaking havoc on my presentation. I'm jumping a little bit now too. So that one was done in 1997. In 2004, I was given a small grant through the McLaughlin Art Gallery in Oshawa to go to China. I've never been to China before. My father was from there, and I went there to do some research. And part of it was just not having any anticipation or expectations of anything. I kind of wandered through the streets. And one day I came to this small museum located in a temple, and I saw this beautiful little woodcut. And the woodcut is about this big, and it was so different from all the other ones I had seen to that point. People in China, when they make paper cuts, they were paper cut. People in China were amazing in terms of their technical abilities, and they were the images are always kind of celebratory, propitious, fruits and flowers, kind of beautiful text. But what I found that was compelling about this work is that it was also kind of inexplicable. I'm not sure why 2 men flanked a tree trunk, why there's a head suspended in the middle of the branches, and why there are birds flanking or kind of circumventing the tips of the trees. But looking at this image, it immediately reminded me of an engraving done by a French artist. His name is Jacques Callot, and C-A-L-L-O-T. This engraving is probably this big, and it's called Les Misères et les Malheurs de la Guerre. So the miseries and misfortunes of war. And it was done in 1633. There was a suite of 18 of these engravings. For me, what's really interesting is that it predates Goya's by nearly 200 years. So here is another thing I would like to mention is that when I'm talking about my work or making work, I tend not to be really specific because I feel maybe collectively we're stuck in this cycle. We're all haunted. We're all kind of haunting ourselves, and we can never get out of that cycle. So here's a war that predates Goya's disasters of war, and it just continues to even this day. And this was based on the 30-year war. So that little paper cut reminded me of this engraving by Goya. I thought I should go home and start making some paper cuts, and they would be about trees and about figures in the trees. And prior to that, I just want to show you this other image, which also came into my head because I really felt that earlier engraving had these figures hanging in the trees. They reminded me of lynching that took place in the States, especially with the blacks. And so this is where the image and the witness, or trauma, memory, and visual culture, that book I was talking about, written in this in particular chapter by James Poultrin. So he was talking about how to read these photographs. And I found it completely amazing that the way he can take me through and make me feel like I'm not just there as a voyeur, that I had a say. So what he commented, the comments he made were, I know it's really quite interesting. This show, which is called Without Sanctuary, traveled for 2 years, and it went from one city to another city, and so it went to different venues. And every time the show traveled, it changed. The concept changed because they were reading the way people were engaging with these works. So they were modifying the exhibition to really, in a way, thinking about how the viewers would be constructing these images or reconstructing them. So some things I found really interesting includes, as viewers looking at this, we're actually standing in the position of the photographer who's taking this picture. And we need to know why is it that this picture is taken and what does it actually say. So in a way, the photograph is taken to kind of glorify that event, to kind of perpetuate these states, and to kind of condone the violence and to talk about how the blacks are at that time inferior. So in terms of he's talking about these images. He says we need to look at these images, but they need to be contextualized in the right way so that they can be read and that we would have a sense of empowerment to look at them. So at the end, he's actually saying that the way it was finally shown in the South was that they painted the walls black, and it has nothing to do with my painting the walls black, but literally they made a memorial of the photographs. They reduced the numbers of photographs that were presented, and there were music played in the space to really talk about each of the people that were executed or killed. So they were given a name and kind of a history, so that every person wasn't just an anonymous object as in a photograph or in a postcard. I found that really quite compelling. So the writer, James Poultrin, also talked about how you can transform yourself from being just a pure spectator into a witness. So the witnessing is also entailing a form of speech that you have to first participate in this kind of spectacular event, and then speak about it and talk about it and take it into history. So this is something that I'm kind of grappling with, because I feel very fortunate that I've never had any of these things, yet I'm always drawn to these kind of inhumanity events, inhumane events, and I feel like I need to just talk about them. And so I'm still dealing with this, thinking about what is my right to actually even start to negotiate these events. So when I came back, I started to make paper cuts, and obviously it's self-taught, and I cut on the wall, I generated an image, and I would just cut. And when I started to make my cuts, I wanted them to be big, because I didn't want them to reside in the realm of craft. Not that there's anything wrong with craft, but I really feel they need to speak, they need to have a power. So the first 3 that I made were 10 feet by 13 feet wide, and they were bigger than my studio space. So I had to fold them in half, turn them sideways, and cut them. So the only time I got to see them was when they were displayed elsewhere. And that's the same with my installations. I can never see my installations until they're actually set up in the space. So that creates a lot of anxiety. So this is the 4th one that I did, which I would say more directly reference that small paper cut, and also Callot's engraving. In this work, the background is completely symmetrically cut, but the figures are asymmetrically placed. And there's one figure, and it pays homage to the lynching, which is on the top left corner, so that figure is very passive, just kind of hangs there very limply, and then the other figures are very active. In fact, they're looking back, so they're actually staring back at you, the viewer, looking at the paper cut. So I've done a few more larger ones. There are always this kind of ambiguous situations. For instance, in the lower right corner, there are 2 figures, and one's maybe helping the other one, or it's actually taking the other figure up to be suspended on top. So I like to kind of play with that sense of ambiguity, because I feel Any minute, I may be that person being led up, or I may be that person leading this figure up. I'm culpable. In 2009, I was invited to the Chinese Arts Center in Liverpool to make an installation, and it was part of a residency. And when I was there, I started to research into the history of Chinese immigration, because Liverpool has the most fantastic Chinese restaurants, because it has a huge Chinese community. And my interest in immigration quickly turned to the history of illegal immigration, well, through several different events. One of them was the death of several illegal immigrants who went out to pick cockle shells by the ocean, and they all drowned. So that's where it began, and they were actually called ghosts by the local Chinese communities because they had to remain under the radar of the government. The minute they're found, they're kind of taken away, brought back to their own country. So I love that kind of play, the sense of kind of presence and absence of these figures. And so I started to research into more on the history of illegal immigration. And I also came upon these people called the burnt ones. They're mainly North African young men trying to get from North Africa to Europe. And what they have to do is they have to destroy their identity papers and travel through these terrible conditions, and many of them drown. So there's a double tragedy again, because first they had to destroy their own sense of identity, their history, and then when they die and they're never found, it's as if they've never existed. So this is very poignant for me. So I started to think about sense of migration and just crossing borders and this kind of futility, but this sense of feeling empowered to be able to travel. Part of my interest in this kind of journey is, as a kid, I traveled to Canada with my family. I didn't know where I was going, but I really felt it was going to be a better place. So this hopefulness, I think, guided me in terms of looking at and trying to explore and research this work, which is called Memento. So these are just some of my research material showing you the strait that they cross. I looked at some images online of these surveillance cameras capturing people trying to cross fences and borders, and how borders, even in modern days, are continually being built to kind of keep people out or in. This is like the Berlin Wall in a way, all over again. So when I was thinking about the work for the Chinese Arts Center, the curator wanted me to make a piece using paper cut. And I didn't want to be known as a paper cut guy, and I resisted. So I decided I would journey to the ocean and think about the power of the water and make a piece from there. I was very lucky because the day I arrived, days prior to my arrival, there had been a big storm. So all these ropes and fish wires, even bits of clothes washed ashore. And I thought, when I saw this, that the piece was going to be made with rope. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that when I start to research, I'm really open to ideas and possibilities, and anything that may help me deal with my work, it's just like my radars are really wide open and taking in things. And so I thought, okay, it's got to be rope, and it's perfect because before the show even began to tour, the curator said to me, it's going to go to 5 different venues, including China. Every space will be different. They'll have different scales and configurations, so the work had to be light. It had to be easily portable. It had to be easily reconfigured. I had to hand carry it. So I satisfied all those conditions. And so because again, it's new for me. I've never used rope before. What do I do with the rope? And I thought I need to kind of make something about the water. So I also looked at sea fans and looking at the patterns, because now, again, I may be venturing too closely to craft, so how do I get away from that? So what I made was this kind of undulating installation using rope, different kinds of ropes, to simultaneously create a sense of water and waves, and also maybe refugee camps or tents. And so the viewers can actually walk in around and see this piece. It still satisfies some of the paper cut qualities in that if you shine a light onto this work, it casts really beautiful shadows. So I guess also for me, what's interesting is that I like to make works that are beautiful, or somehow that's aesthetic, only insofar as I feel Well, part of it is I feel I need to seduce a viewer and bring them into my work, and that's one way to do it, through this kind of materiality, this seduction of this aesthetic, whatever that means. But I really want to draw the viewers in, and once I can get them into my space, they can decide how long they want to linger and experience the work. What you'll see here as well are these mirrors. They're oval mirrors. There are 5 of them suspended in the space. I kind of see them as moons. And what they do is they pick up the current that's in the space, which is completely invisible, but the currents will move them, so they start to revolve in the space. And I've done one video, and in the video screen I've kind of made these oval movies, and they're projected and register exactly to the mirrors that are suspended in the room. So when the video's images, the 5 images hit the mirrors, and the mirrors are turning, they take these images around the space. So these sense of journey, the movements are played out in the movement of this installation. So most of the images are called from YouTube regarding people crossing borders or boundaries, save for one, and it's the one that's on the back wall. I literally just set the camera down in Manchester in a mall to track people's movements. So they were going to shopping, they're going home. So this is a certainty that's in their daily routine. They know where they're going, they know where they're going back to. And I counter that with the other ones where these people didn't know what would be waiting ahead of them at the end of the day. So just in terms of material, because I've never used rope before, it was also about like what colors, what kind of rope to use, what kind of knot. So there are all these different negotiations that are constantly appearing, but the only way I knew how to answer those questions was actually through the making. So the minute I started making, I just knew. I knew that to make a peak, I need to build these triangular shapes, and when I put them together, they would become a peak, and if I tip them, they would just become a dip in the ocean, let's say. So it's really, I don't know, just it's more than being intuitive. It's really getting your hands in there, and then by making, you kind of know what will follow. And also making mistakes is great too, because it will, by taking chances and making mistakes, you get to work it out. Yeah. So again, thinking about myself as an artist that draws. This, to me, was completely exciting because I'm now drawing in 3-dimensional space. I'm able to create tension. What I've also done is I brought sandbags that are empty to these places. When I got there, I filled them with local sand to create these tension and these torques, allowing these pieces to have their own kind of energy and form. Yes? Sorry, you have to speak up. How long did it to master the building? Well, I'm very lucky because if I was teaching here, some of you would become my assistants when I need help. So I had some of my students come and help me. Obviously, some know how to knot and some don't, and I had tons of books on how to tie knots. But I know the rudimentaries of knot making, and it isn't really about making a beautiful knot. It's really about thinking how the process will lead to an artwork. So I'm not caught up in the making as much, even though the process is really important to me, and the look is important to me. But there are probably lots of flaws in there. I was going to say, on the left, there's another video, and it's a screen, and it's me sitting in the water, just being pounded by waves. So I was trying to find the lowest gravity position for myself, making myself as vulnerable as possible to just sit there and to contemplate the energy and the forces of the ocean. Again, it doesn't approximate the events other people go through, but I really just wanted to have a physical engagement with the things that I'm kind of dealing with. And as a Taiwanese, or born as Taiwanese, even though I don't believe in ghosts, everyone in China and Taiwan, we're all afraid of ghosts. Other people can tell you this. So sitting in the water, being pulled and kind of pushed, it really reminded me of these water ghost stories. Like in the water in Taiwan, there are these ghosts waiting for you. And if you were to fall in, they would pull you in. And the story is that these are people who had drowned, and their souls are forever trapped in that place until they pull someone else in. So, and you can really feel like these arms and hands grabbing you when you're sitting, and the waves is coming. What I also did was I made these small paper cuts of figures, and they're placed here and there in the installation, because I also want to shift the scale of the work. So at the moment you saw these little figures, that installation became a landscape where these figures had to traverse. And so suddenly it became even more treacherous, because it had these big hills and these big troughs. And so they kind of just appear depending on the way the light plays with them, because they're white and the wall is white. So at a certain moment they'll just be quite visible. At a certain moment they disappear, and you will see the shadows before seeing the actual cuts, for instance. And just looking at this, I'm very excited about the fact that this can be a drawing, even though it's just a shadow. It's not tangible, and it has different kinds of processes that are involved to make this drawing. You know, like you can just make a drawing on a piece of paper like this. For me to go from here to there through these other knots, it's a very slow process, and there's also tension. There's also consideration of where I should actually tie and go forward. So the decisions are very different, and the results are similar, but at the same time quite drastically varied. Earlier on, I mentioned how I need to make things that are really easy to travel with. So this is my luggage. So that's Nicole, my assistant, and my partner came with us as well. So we each had 3 luggage, 1 for our own private items and 2 that made the artwork. So the 3 of us, so we had, let's say, 6 pieces of luggage that made the artwork. So we went to Sydney for the Sydney Biennale. I still had to make more work, so in fact I did buy more materials when I got to Sydney. But part of it was actually painting ropes like this, blue. And these just represented random raindrops. I wanted to create a corridor using ropes coming down as if there were rain falling down. The story for Sydney is really interesting because it doesn't happen very often where a curator would be very specific in asking certain or having certain demands. So for instance, Jero and Catherine came to my studio, and I thought they were just there to pay a studio visit. And in fact, they didn't even look at my work that were up on the walls. They just said, so for the Sydney Biennale, we'd like to have you use paper, and it has to deal with water, and it you also had to interview elders. You also had to collaborate with Tanya Tagak, the throat singer, and what else? There were a few other elements. And I actually welcome these input because I feel, even though they gave me certain parameters, as an artist, I am always setting my own parameters. If I didn't have any limits or boundaries, I wouldn't even know where to start or stop. So for me, it was a really nice challenge. And so because I'm dealing with water, I now have to kind of just open my radars up to anything about water and do as much reading and research as I can. And so because of that, certain things happen. And I don't know if they're planned or they just came along fortuitously. I'm just showing you some shots of the installation. So literally, my pieces are hung with PVC pipes, and they're all Velcroed. So I literally take the paper that's in the suitcase, they're wrinkled, and they're hung on the walls to create these architectural spaces. Conceptually, it was really difficult for me to work because I was given these parameters, and what is it about water that hasn't been said? In terms of water, people talk about renewal, rebirth, purification, and transformation. And I just thought these are all valid, but to me, if I were to go there, it feels like I haven't done my research. It would be completely cliched. So as I started to do my research, I realized, and after talking to elders in Dawson City, after having heard this amazing CBC interview, radio interview, I decided to kind of tackle water, thinking about the First Nations and their plight, their lack of access to fresh water in Canada. So I actually had a meeting with Mero Ann S. Fair, who's a First Nations lawyer who wrote a book called Source, Denying the Source. And when I talked to the elders, they were talking about how the fish that they fish used to be bigger, and they now they're deformed, or their flesh is really soft. And I thought, wow, I can still put that sense of transformation in my work, except that transformation isn't from mythology, but it's from reality. It's a way we're playing with the environment. So this space, I should say, this space is huge. It's 4,000 square feet, and the ceiling is probably like 30 feet. It's the largest space that I had ever had to deal with. So what I'd done was I made this piece into 3 sections, so I can actually show each of the individual sections by themselves, because I don't know when it will be the next opportunity I'll have to present this whole thing as one piece. There are other situations. Gerald took pains to tell me that the windows and doors are completely open, pigeons fly in, and they may do their business on my work, and it may rain. So actually I cheated. I used Tyvek for some of the sections. And the silver section are actually these interference patterns using these amazing Japanese papers that were made from dipping water and oil. So you get these kind of, those Easter egg things. But they're Japanese paper, they're antique Japanese paper. And when I play with the interference by overlapping them together, I was thinking about the power of water and also tsunami, because that had just happened months before. So I was thinking about everything that water can do, including its destructive forces, obviously. And the silver is actually a 3M reflector material, which is really hard to capture on the camera, but it has this beautiful luminous quality. So if imagine the sunset hitting the water, you have this kind of glow. That's what it would look like. So as with all my installations, I like them to be as immersive as possible, to approximate a change in the environment for the viewer to experience. So there are these little holes that suggest the depth of water, and if you were to look in them, and they're all made with layers and layers of paper, that you will see these drawings of little creatures that are kind of hybridized or transformed, kind of grotesqueries of creatures. And I don't know what time it is. Okay. So this is a book by Mero Ann S. Fair, and what I did was this. I had one of my assistants count every word to figure out how many letters there are. Every number becomes 1 inch. So the first word has seven inches, and then the space is 1 inch. So everything's mapped out, and then it was transcribed onto ropes. So the entire book is spelled out in this corridor of rain. I really wanted to acknowledge this book. At the same time, I really feel by this gesture, I was also erasing the meaning that's contained in this book, because I feel this book went unnoticed. There's a kind of silence that happened to her voice, and to the I would say the urgency of the situation or the conditions that exist for many of the First Nations people. So this was what I did as part of the element. So here is, there's just like thousands. It was really a time-consuming event. And then when this was all put up, there's a paper that's covering this, so you walk through this corridor. So the blue ones are just random colors, and the black ones all spell out the book in its entirety. So in terms of transformation, as Patrick mentioned earlier, there's this kind of play with performative, cinematic. Sometimes I put myself into my work. So in this case, I decided to play with these kind of lumpy forms as a way to think about transformation of deformities and growths. So my movements will be based on how much I can actually move once I had all these things taped on my body. So I was becoming a transformed creature. And I really like shadow plays, but I play with shadows in a way that's fairly different in the sense I use clear mylar. So what clear mylar offers, aside from a darkened area, it also offers this luminous flared areas. So simultaneously, it's a shadow and it's also a light. And this is a shadow, and for me, it's one of the most beautiful drawings that I can ever make. You know, that if you were really good at using Conte or charcoal or pencil, you may be able to approximate this kind of rendering. So it's something that I aspire to, and I know it would be futile to even try to make. And I'll show you a video. Actually, maybe I should show you a slow. Okay, so I'm going to stop this, which can be. So these are just different tests that I was working on to get the thing going. Oh, I don't know where my cursor is now. Okay. Well, I don't want to linger on this one because I want to show you other ones. But what I actually want to play right now is the sound. So Tanya and I got together. So these were all edited, but these were just moments where I had to make the taping, so it's actually pretty bad. Let me just stop that. Uh-oh. How do I stop? Okay. So I'll play the sound. So Tanya and I, I'll just turn that a bit. I don't know if you know Tanya Tagak's work. She actually was in town this past weekend to perform at the Great Hall, and she was amazing. So Gerald and Gerald introduced her to me, and she happened to be in town 2 years ago, so we were able to record her singing. I don't know if you all know Inuit throat singing. It's quite phenomenal. Essentially, there are two women. They are close to each other's face, and they throw their voices back and forth in their mouths. So the mouths become this kind of resonating chamber. It's really beautiful. They're fairly short, and they always end up in breaking out with laughter, and that's how they end. So, but Tanya's unique in that she does it by herself. She creates these moments, and she also relies on technology in terms of editing with sound to create these moments. So I mentioned to her what my installation would be, what I'm thinking of, even though I haven't made anything yet. But I had gone to Australia already, and I brought back this book, this huge book on different sea creatures. And I gave her the book, and I said, maybe you can imagine yourself to be these creatures and make sounds and voices based on those. So that's what she was doing. And then it was all edited together. So in terms of the installation, there were two sections. One was this overall ambient sound as if you were underwater, and then as you went close to another section, you actually hear her very kind of textural sounds. She was also splashing water in a metal pot. I'm not doing her sound any justice. You have to experience the whole thing. But I'll stop this for now. I'll go back to my PowerPoint. Let's back to the beginning. So as I was mentioning earlier, I had my radars open and I happened to come across Jean-Pain Levé's work. And he's an undersea scientist, and he predates Jacques Cousteau. And what's really interesting about his work, he kind of animates the creatures that he's studying, so he gives them as kind of human quality. He will talk about octopus and seahorses in a way that makes them human somehow. And I thought of him when I was also making this work. And so if you were to look at his films, and there's some on, I think, YouTube, they're always subtitled, and it's his own voice. There's nothing scientific. He actually says science is a fiction. So he inputs his own ideals about what these creatures will be doing. So I made a whole bunch of, with the help of my studio assistants, we made a whole bunch of props that I would wear that would become part of the installation. So this is part of the section where I created 2 layers of mylar cuts. So the whole thing is transparent and it's quite ghostly. So what I did was I videotaped myself interacting with these sea creatures. They're actually hanging in that space. And the video projector goes through and hits all the layers of, I'll call them objects, and casts the final shadow on the outer wall. So the shadow of me is there as a video projection. It's conflated with actual shadows because the light of the video is projecting the actual object's shadows onto the wall as well. So simultaneously you will see the real and the video projections. So for a lot of people it's quite disconcerting because it feels as if I'm in there but I'm not there to interact with these objects. I'm going to just quickly show you my piece for Moscow. Is that okay? For the Moscow Biennale, I was asked to consider the concept of home, what constitutes home. And it reminded me of this drawing by Shuvana Asuna I had purchased in 2005. It's a large piece. There are 12 units that make up this work. It's done very meticulously, I would say obsessively, using pen and ink over these sheets of paper. And it's a bird's eye view of Cape Dorset. And so my first introduction to this area was through her drawing, or through her eyes. So you can see the little portable houses, very similar to the ones that were at the Visual Arts Department prior to that building being built. So there's something about temporality, about it being not so serious, about it kind of being overlooked, let's say. So and this is how she draws. She literally lies on her table and she just draws, as Shuvana. So last year I had the fortune of going there through TD Bank. They were starting a residency. And so the idea is that they will bring a northern artist down south and a southern artist up north to have this exchange. So this is what I experienced when I got there, kind of the snowy landscape with these portables. So it's very true to what Shuv and I had depicted. You can see everything looked very prefabricated, very lacking in the sense of home. And I was also fascinated with the drawings that she has made of these tents. So for the Biennale, I decided that I would consider this portable home as a place where there's a sense of freedom, this ability to have this sense of autonomy to roam and to kind of travel and to find who you are through this wandering, let's say. Because a lot of most of the Inuit people from up north, they were nomads. They were forced to be placed in a community. So I wanted to consider this kind of freedom that they once had, and how to make a home out of something that's completely not so interesting. And in fact, I went to a conference and I was told that 50% of these homes have mold in them. So the problem arises from the fact that there's poor ventilation, the weather is so extreme that these houses need constant upkeep. So some of the social problems that arise are from the fact that they don't have a decent place to live. And so not every issue is about the house or housing, But many of the other issues stem from the fact that there's issue with housing. So this will be a tent that's made for them to travel. So I had to think about what to make. Again, I'm thinking of portability. So I made these mylar houses that are collapsible, like this Chinese takeout food boxes, cartons. So I made over 100 of these. They all collapse into a suitcase. And this is an example of them popped open. So again, I'm playing with a sense of light through these constructions and playing with shadows of figures interacting with this. This is my niece, actually, from London, Ontario. She wanted to be in this piece. So I also invited Naulak, who's an Inuit, who does a lot of interpretation for artists who come south. So she was part of my actor, playing a part. So this is her with her granddaughter, kind of interacting with the. So these are all actually videos, and so I made an installation inside a tent. As with all my work I mentioned before, the installations are bigger than my space, and this is just a roof, and it filled my entire studio. The exhibition space is 18 feet high, and the space I was given is 17 feet by 17 feet. So my space is just clear 17 feet wide, and it's 11 feet high. So I built the roof of the tent as a unit, then I built the wall as a separate unit. And the thing that you see in the middle is actually a pillar that's inside the exhibition space that I had to deal with. So I kind of built it to figure out how I was going to suspend this piece, which couldn't be hung from the ceiling. It had to just hang from the pillar. And this is a piece that I'm proposing to show at the Macintosh, but I had to make a new roof so that the whole piece is quite a bit lower to be able to fit into that space. So again, I've never done a tent before. I had an architect to figure out the angles for the piece and how to sew it. I had a friend help me do this. So everything was speculative. I used ropes to balance the rings out so that they would just hang on these two bars. It was very scary because when I get to the site, it was real. There was no like, oh, I'm sorry I didn't work this out. I had to just set it up and it had to work. So this is me in the real site setting up the tent, and then it became this piece. So again, I used some of the similar play with mirrors and clear mylar cuts. And this is a video projection. This is when the video image disappears, it just casts lights. And one is green and one's mauve, which are the lights that are refracted from the mylar. And at a certain moment, the image appears, and it's Naulak with her granddaughter moving and kind of building these houses. And on the inside, I have a layer cut to look like frost, and in it are these little houses. So the video projectors are positioned on the floor. They cast the real shadows through with a video of these shadows. So I'm going to show you, and I may need Julia's help in terms of the video. So this is a very short clip to show you how the shadows work. So I bought a simple Lazy Susan from Lee Valley. I put on a piece of wood. I had the houses turned to play with movement. So the boy is real, everything else is a projection. So those are actual shadows.
You can't ban is making it.
Okay, so This is the images, the end of the image that I'll show you, but I'll just talk a little bit in terms of my research into haunting. Not to reiterate everything that I've stated, I feel there is a lot of research being done that constitutes haunting. There's hauntology by Jacques Derrida, and but I think there's something more. I feel there needs to be something more in the sense that, in a way, we're all haunted, and some people are kind of compelled to do certain things. For some of the First Nations people, they commit suicide, for instance. There's an overwhelming amount of people who actually kill themselves, and I feel at this moment, there are different courses to take, and one is this very extreme route, and the other is to be empowered to go forward. And I feel in those situations, when you're called to do something, when you're compelled to do something, I propose maybe there's a term like being possessed. So aside from just being haunted, I feel there needs to be an active word that's also a positive word. That I know that maybe possession seems very much like spooky and horror and Hollywood again, but I really feel I need to find another word that takes me to another level in terms of my research and contemplation of the work that I'm looking at. Anyway, so I don't know how to end this, but thank you so much, and I look forward to coming back in 2 years' time to maybe present this work at Macintosh.